I oftentimes hear pastors teaching on the errors of the Hebrew roots and using Colossians chapter 2, 14 and 16. These verses are probably two of the most misused verses in all of the New Testament. Stay with me for a moment and let me plead my case. First, let's read these verses. Colossians 2, 14. Blotting out the handwriting of ordinances that was against us, which was contrary to us, and took it out of the way, nailing it to the cross. And verse 16. Let no man therefore judge you in meat, or in drink, or in respect of a holy day, or of the new moon, or of the Sabbath days. The pastors will use verse 14 as proof text that the instructions given by God to Moses, commonly called the Torah, are no longer in effect. It's been nailed to the cross, they say. Understand that the very definition of sin is transgression of the law. In fact, John tells us this in very plain terms. 1 John 3:4. Whosoever commits sin transgresses also the law, for sin is transgression of the law. That's what sin is, transgression of the instructions God gave to Moses. In fact, our Messiah, when speaking in Luke 16, talks about a rich man who wishes to come back from his deathly torment in order to get his brothers to repent. What does Jesus tell him? Luke 16, verse 31. And he said unto him, If they hear not Moses and the prophets, neither will they be persuaded through one rose from the dead. This was a rich man concerned about getting his brothers to repent. Why? Repent from what? From breaking the law given by God to Moses. The rich man was in torment because he refused to love his poor neighbor while himself lived the good life. He broke the law. Leviticus 19:18. Thou shalt not avenge, nor bear any grudge against the children of thy people, but thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. The ordinances that Paul says is nailed to the cross are the sins that we have committed by breaking the law, thus deserving punishment for doing so. Then in verse 16, he goes over some of those ordinances, like keeping the Sabbath, keeping the feast days, eating clean meats, and the avoidance of pagan customs of like drinking blood. You see, the Messiah didn't come to free us from the ordinances. He freed us from the punishment we deserve for breaking those ordinances. It's the punishment we are set free from, being nailed to the cross. An ordinance that is against you is an ordinance you have broken. We are not free from the ordinances. We are free from the penalty the ordinance brings when we break it. It's so simple. And Paul is simply saying in verse 16 not to let people judge you for now keeping these commandments that were once against us. Let's read verse 16 again. Let no man therefore judge you in meat or in drink or in respect of a holy day or of the new moon or of the Sabbath days. The book of Colossians was written by the Apostle Paul to the believers in Colossae, which is located in what is today southwest Turkey. I said southwest Turkey. Let that sink in for a second. The site for Colossae in southwest Turkey is over 800 miles driving distance from Jerusalem, located in Judea. Not exactly a place full of Jewish synagogues and legalistic Jewish leaders. But when reading verse 16, it seems to be saying to the readers to not allow themselves to be judged by those who would ridicule them for not keeping the Sabbath, or the new moons, or eat and drink and feast days. Wait a minute. If there are few to no Jews in Colossae, Turkey, 800 miles away from Jerusalem, well then, who is judging these new believers? Could it be that these new believers are not being judged by Jewish legalists, but instead are being judged by pagan idolaters living amongst them? Let's read verse 16 again. Let no man therefore judge you in meat or in drink or in respect of a holy day or of the new moon or of the Sabbath days. What Paul is saying to the Colossians is not to let any man judge you for eating clean meat, not to let any man judge you for not drinking blood, not to let any man judge you for keeping feast days and observing the new moons or for observing the Sabbath. These were new believers, and they were living amongst pagan Gentiles who commonly ate unclean meats and drank blood. The drinking of blood was even addressed in Acts 15 in the Jerusalem Council headed by James. It was a basic requirement for the new believer. Stop drinking blood, as this was a common practice in those days amongst Gentiles, and in some parts of the world, it's still practiced. These new believers were being judged for keeping biblical festivals, the feast days given in Leviticus 23 that the pagans in the area of southwest Turkey did not participate in. Yet pastors today will whip this verse right out when confronted with people who keep the Sabbath and who eat biblically clean meats and celebrate feast times like unleavened bread and Sukkot. How about Paul when he says, I must by all means keep this coming feast, and keeping the feast of Pentecost, that was the feast of Shavuot? Wait a minute, Paul kept the feast? So why do these pastors get all bent out of shape when we do? Paul even gives us more of a clue that his letter to Colossae is written to believers living among pagans and other parts of the book when he mentions twice the traditions and doctrines of men living in the world. You see, pagans in that part of the world had their own traditions and doctrines they followed. They had their own dietary beliefs and their own holiday celebrations. They had their own ways that differed greatly with the ways of our Creator. We are to be a set-apart people, a peculiar people, and anyone comparing the people of God with the people of the world should see a stark difference. Except, today you have Christians who keep a Sabbath instituted by Rome and the Emperor Constantine 1700 years ago. Christians celebrate the same festivals as non-Christians the world over. In fact, if you go to visit Indonesia in December, you will see around the cities all kinds of Christmas decorations and images of Santa Claus. Folks, we are talking about the most populated Muslim nation on the planet, and they are keeping Christmas. Christmas, Easter, Halloween, Valentine's Day are all celebrations that you will not find anyone in the New Testament keeping. Easter, however, is found all throughout the Old Testament as something the Father commands his people to stay away from. Easter, or Ishtar, has long been a celebration and worship of fertility. And what are the symbols of Easter? Eggs, bunny rabbits, symbols of fertility. Colossae was a city that had a small group of believers, former Gentiles, living amongst pagans. And Paul's letter to them was a letter of encouragement for being set apart, a peculiar people, just like the Creator of the universe expects his children to be.